Atheist Buddhism and Empirical Science. Science and Spirituality. A scientist stepped onto the forum stage, clutching a thick dossier in his hand. His sharp gaze swept across the audience. He tapped the microphone lightly and spoke in a resonant tone. We live in the age of science, where everything must be verified by experiment. If it cannot be measured, if it cannot be repeated, then it is mere superstition. A round of applause erupted from the proponents of positivism, those who believe that science is the only path to truth. On the opposite side, a Buddhist follower smiled quietly. He carried no documents and displayed no complex charts, holding only one simple question. If someone has never tasted salt, can you use mathematics to explain its salinity? The hall fell silent. The scientist frowned and replied, "We can analyze the chemical composition of salt, measure its effect on the taste buds, and explain the neural mechanisms when the tongue contacts sodium chloride." The Buddhist nodded. But would that help the person truly know what saltiness is? That question has no absolute answer, and it lies at the heart of the debate between empirical science and atheist Buddhism. One side insists that only what can be measured is trustworthy, that anything beyond experimentation is fanciful. The other side does not deny science but raises another issue. Does reality lie only in what we can measure? If science cannot yet prove consciousness, does that mean consciousness does not exist? If experiences such as meditative awakening or rebirth cannot be placed in a laboratory, are they merely illusions? This is not simply a debate between theory and practice, between faith and science. It is a question of how humans perceive the world. If Buddhism is atheist, does that equate it with positivism? And if science rejects the divine, is it a replacement for Buddhism? Or are both viewing the same reality from two different perspectives? Positivism. Positivism is not a new theory. It emerged in the 19th century when Auguste Comte proclaimed that only what can be observed, measured, and verified is meaningful. Everything beyond the reach of scientific inquiry was deemed meaningless and unworthy of discussion. Since then, positivism has become the foundation of modern science, guiding humanity from the darkness of religious dogma into the era of reason and experiment. Yet there is a problem. As science advances at a breakneck pace, might it inadvertently become a new form of religion? The 21st century is the age of numbers, data, and statistical models. We believe in scientists as our ancestors believed in deities. When a study reports that a particular food may cause cancer, the world rushes to change its diet. When a new theory is proven, millions accept it without verification. From physics and biology to neuroscience, modern science seems capable of explaining everything, from the origin of the universe to the workings of the human brain. While rejecting traditional religious systems, science itself is becoming a dogma few dare to question. Modern empiricism relies on repetition and measurement. If an experiment cannot be reproduced under identical conditions, it cannot be considered truth. Does that mean every aspect of life can be repeated? Can every phenomenon in the universe be examined under a microscope? Can one prove suffering or happiness with a mathematical equation? If a person attains enlightenment, is there a way to measure or recreate that experience in a laboratory? Science's confidence today leads many to believe humanity is approaching absolute understanding of the universe. Yet history shows that past scientific truths were once regarded as unquestionable but later proved mistaken. Before Einstein, Newtonian mechanics reigned supreme. Before quantum theory, classical mechanics seemed perfect. So might today's scientific certainties be merely a phase in the evolution of human understanding? Atheist Buddhism. Buddhism does not posit a creator deity, no supreme being deciding human fate, no eternal heaven or hell. But does that make Buddhism identical to positivism? It is not so simple. If positivism recognizes only what can be measured, Buddhism views the world differently. It does not rely solely on what can be seen or touched, but also on what can be directly experienced in the mind. From the time of the Buddha, he never asked his followers to believe blindly. When asked, who speaks the truth among the many competing doctrines, he did not instruct them to trust him. He said, "Do not accept anything merely because it is traditional or taught by authority. Test it for yourself." This approach is not that of a faith based on blind belief, but that of a seeker of truth by experiment. However, Buddhist experimentation does not occur in a laboratory, but within the mind of each individual. If a scientist wants to understand the universe, he studies subatomic particles, physical laws, and chemical reactions. But to understand one's own nature, one must explore the inner world, observe the workings of thought and emotion, and recognize the impermanence of perception. This is why Buddhism emphasizes meditation, not as a ritual of faith, but as a tool to observe reality at its deepest level. When one meditates, one is not merely sitting still, but actively experimenting with the mind. Here's where positivism cannot reach. Modern science can measure brainwaves and observe biochemical changes during meditation, but it cannot gauge the sense of peace one feels when fully awakened. It can study how people process emotions yet cannot directly experience liberation from suffering. If science only trusts what it can measure, it may overlook the most essential part of reality, what each of us can only discover through direct experience. Buddhism requires no belief in a deity, yet it is not as extreme as positivism. By rejecting all that cannot yet be measured, it does not deny science but establishes an important limit. Science can investigate the material world, but it cannot replace personal insight into one's own nature. A scientist may publish hundreds of studies on happiness, but only someone who lives in that state truly understands it. One may debate the notion of no self, but only by realizing it firsthand does one know its reality. Is Buddhism a science? It is not science in the positivist sense, for it does not confine itself to what can be measured. Yet it is an experimental method in a deeper sense, a science of consciousness, in which each person is a researcher and the mind is the laboratory. And if science seeks truth through microscopes and particle accelerators, Buddhism seeks truth in the stillness of the mind. One studies the external world, the other explores the internal world. Might both be pointing to the same reality, or are they simply traveling along two different paths? Debate. If Buddhism has no faith in a creator deity, should it be grouped with positivism? This is precisely the point of contention between the two schools. A positivist scientist would argue that if concepts like rebirth, karma, or enlightenment cannot be measured by experiment, then they are mere fantasies. There is no way to prove that someone can be reborn or that actions in this life produce effects in another life. If science has not demonstrated it, does it mean those things do not exist? A Buddhist would counter that science cannot measure everything, because science is only a tool for understanding the material world. Consider a simple example. Before telescopes existed, humanity could not see distant galaxies. Before MRI technology, we could not observe how the brain functions during thought. The fact that science could not measure something in the past does not mean it does not exist, only that we lack the appropriate tool to discover it. One of positivism's greatest limitations is its insistence on reproducibility under controlled conditions. But what if some experiences occur only once, or can only be felt and never measured? If someone attains enlightenment in meditation, can they recreate that experience in a laboratory? If a person recalls memories of a past life, how could science verify that according to its methods? The scientist might press further. If you cannot measure it, how do you distinguish truth from illusion? If someone claims enlightenment, how can you know it is genuine rather than a hallucination? Buddhism answers, you must taste hot or cold water yourself to know its temperature. You must practice meditation yourself to know whether it changes perception. You must observe your own life to verify karma. Buddhism does not force anyone to believe but encourages direct experience. So what is the nature of reality? Science says the universe is matter, that consciousness is a product of the brain, that everything can be explained by physical laws. Buddhism says consciousness is not dependent on matter, but is the foundation of all experience. Matter may be real, but without a mind to perceive it, does it truly exist? This echoes the famous philosophical question, if a tree falls in the forest and no one is there to hear it, does it make a sound? At this point, it is no longer simply science versus religion, but two ways of perceiving reality in conflict. One insists the objective world is supreme and truth lies in what can be measured and analyzed. The other insists perception is central and that consciousness determines how we experience reality. If consciousness cannot be measured yet is the most important factor in perceiving the world, is science overlooking the most vital element? Thus, if Buddhism is seen as a mystical belief system, it seems at odds with positivism. Yet if we view it as an experimental method for exploring the nature of mind, Buddhism comes closer to science than any other religion. Mutual development. Positivism and atheist Buddhism may appear opposed, but upon closer examination they share surprising common ground. Both reject the existence of an omnipotent creator. Both rely on causality to explain the world. Both encourage inquiry rather than blind faith. We live in an age where science and spirituality have both made extraordinary advances. Modern science is increasingly interested in areas once dismissed as unscientific, for example, the effects of meditation on the brain, the neural mechanisms of enlightenment, the relationship between consciousness and reality. Recent studies show meditation not only alters brain structure, but also directly impacts health, cognition, and emotion. Experiences once regarded as purely personal can now be observed with advanced brain imaging technology. Yet although science can measure changes in brain activity during meditation, it still cannot explain the essence of that experience. A scientist cannot understand enlightenment simply by observing neural signals. To grasp its meaning, they must meditate themselves. Meanwhile, Buddhism is no longer a closed system. Today, many monks, meditation masters, and Buddhist scholars collaborate with scientists to study consciousness, the mind's operation, and the connections between meditation and well-being. The Dalai Lama once said, "If scientists one day demonstrate that a Buddhist doctrine is wrong, then Buddhism must accept the new truth." This rare statement in the religious world shows Buddhism does not cling dogmatically to its views, but is willing to adapt to reality. But what can science learn from Buddhism? One crucial lesson is its view of consciousness. While Western science still debates whether consciousness is merely a product of the brain, Buddhism has long regarded consciousness as an entity separate from matter and not confined by physical processes. This idea may sound unscientific, but when considering near-death experiences, reports of past life memories, and cases in which people shift their states of consciousness without any chemical influence, it seems science has yet to fully understand the nature of consciousness. Similarly, Buddhism needs science. Accuracy and empirical rigor can help sift out myth, superstition, and folk beliefs that have accumulated over time, restoring Buddhism to its original experimental spirit, a practice aimed at wisdom and liberation rather than ritual and dogma. Seen in this light, science and Buddhism are not opposing paths, but different approaches to the same reality. One employs reason and experiment to explore the external world. The other uses meditation and introspection to explore the inner world. And perhaps where science and Buddhism meet is where humanity will draw nearer to absolute truth, where material and mental realms are no longer separate, where understanding arises not only from numbers and formulas, but from the deepest experiences of the human heart. Who truly understands the truth? We have traveled two seemingly opposing paths: positivism, which holds that only what can be measured and verified is reliable, and atheist Buddhism, which does not rely on a deity, but opens a door to experiences beyond the scope of science. Yet if we stop at their opposition, we may miss the most important point. Positivism has helped humanity escape the darkness of superstition, bringing great advances from medical technology to cosmology. But can it truly answer every question? Science can explain the formation of the universe, but it cannot explain why there is existence at all. Science can analyze the brain's mechanisms, but it cannot precisely define what consciousness is. Meanwhile, Buddhism does not accept an all-powerful deity or rely on blind faith, but it proposes a different experimental method, not with microscopes or particle accelerators, but through the human mind itself. Yet if something can only be experienced personally and cannot be measured or verified, is it of any value in the eyes of science? Perhaps humanity's greatest mistake is trying to impose an absolute limit on perception. If we trust only in science, we will overlook the depth of spiritual experience. If we trust only in spirituality without evidence, we risk falling into illusion. But if we can balance both, we can see a more complete picture of reality. Science helps us understand the external world, and Buddhism helps us understand ourselves. If both can coexist, we do not have to choose one or the other, but can use both to achieve a more comprehensive understanding. Truth does not lie within any doctrine, but in each person's own experience. We may debate endlessly about consciousness, reality, karma, or no self, but in the end, all words are merely a finger pointing at the moon. Truth does not lie in the finger, but in the moon itself, which each person must experience directly. And perhaps, when we are no longer bound by prejudice and no longer cling to a single path, that is when we come closer to the ultimate truth, something that has always been there, belonging neither to science nor to Buddhism, but to the very nature of the universe and our own consciousness.